If you're someone that cuddles into bed with your camera and gives it a kiss goodnight, this part upset you depending what camera you own. These are tools made for filmmakers, and you got to ask yourself, are you someone who just buys gear as a hobby, or are you an actual filmmaker with something to say? Or are you running a filmmaking business, which if you are, you're not going to have any personal feelings for any of these tools, these metal objects. All right, guys, in this video, we are comparing the Komodo X in low light versus the FX3. A lot of people are saying that the Komodo X is supposed to do better on low light because we have another half or full stop of dynamic range in the shadows. I see a lot of people trying to compare it to the FX3. The FX3 is a different low light beast. Let me explain it real quick, and then we'll go into the footage. My homie Luis and I, we shot this little fun, little creative thing using this Anchor flashlight and me just lighting up a smoke. All right, guys, for this test, we're gonna light this with the flashlight. This is gonna be our bounce. And then I'm just gonna light up a little CBD smoke thing. You can probably see on the S5 II what our exposure's looking like right now. Yeah, again, it's dark in here. The windows are fairly blackened out. It's not super accurate, but yeah, that's just a little Anchor flashlight back there. All right, guys, let's get into this. So you can see this is where our exposure looks like with all lights off. So let me just turn off my nodes here to show you what I am doing. This one, I'm just cooling down the white balance. I could have done it through the raw settings, but for consistency, I just did it the same way I did on the FX3. This is our noise reduction. And then this is where I recovered the exposure. So before this node, I'm going to just pump up these shadows to show you guys how much information we have in there. So again, these are the HDR wheels. My gamma is set correctly. So you can see how much information. There's a lot of information for how dark this actual exposure is. You can see this how dark it is. That's how much you can recover if you needed to. And you can bump up the ISO here. But when you do that, we're getting even more noise. This looks pretty dang good. It looks pretty clean. Let's go in, let's pixel peep like dummies. You see this was without noise reduction. This is pretty freaking clean. And again, if I turn off that exposure bump, this is totally usable. But with noise reduction, that's what we're getting. Now let's go to the Sony at 800. We're using an anamorphic front adapter. It gets a lot more softer when you're shooting it on full frame, but we also miss focus on top of that. So I apologize. But again, the whole test for this point is to see how clean the noise performance is. But let's go and do the same thing. Let's just go and boost up our shadows. So you see that's all the information in our FX3. So again, when I lift the shadows on the Komodo, you can see our skin tones hold. All the colors are kind of like hugging each other a little bit better. Where on the FX3, you see the way it falls apart, the transitions are very harsh. It almost looks like it's being posterized, where on the red, everything stays smooth. This is the big difference between shooting in 16-bit RAW versus a 10-bit internal codec. You see the noise reduction set the same exact way too. You see that's with it off, noisy, and that's with it on. Now here is the magic trick to the FX3, and that is the 12,800 ISO. That's what this is, but that's what it is out of camera. Look, like this window looks like it's not being blacked out at all. You can see it almost looks like our flame is clipping. But once I go in, I lower that exposure, you see we get a lot of that detail back. I think the fire's still clipping. What I could have done, since at 800 ISO on the FX3, it's kind of pushing it a little bit too dark. I kind of went to 12,800 ISO and used like 2 to 3 stops of ND, and I would have gotten way cleaner results than I would have at 800 ISO, no NDs, if that makes sense. And again, we didn't shift the apertures. You can see the bokeh remains exactly the same between these two shots. It is just going to 12,800 ISO. And this is with no noise reduction on right now. Noise reduction turned off. Look at that clean exposure. And this with the exposure correction turned off. On, when you turn on, it hides all that noise. And then that's with noise reduction. Like that is insanely clean. That is the trick to low light, is they actually either they pump in way more light, or you can cheat it via the sensor by if you have dual gain ISO. So let's do this next shot. This is at ELQ. So we shot this in HQ2, and you see it's a little bit more soft. Transitions on everything's a little bit more smoother. And ELQ still looks great. Let's go in and lift our shadows and see how much details are in there. So no matter how much we pump this up, you see we don't really have that much details here in the skin. There's still some color information, which is wild. The hair is totally clipped, and you see all the noise in there. I can turn noise reduction off. You see it's kind of all over the place, but we have exposure on my face, and that's the important part. Now we're on the Sony FX3 again, and you see that 12,800 ISO just It is insane. We're getting way more exposure on this. Again, let's go back to the Komodo shot. We'll go to the HQ one just to show you guys. Like, this looks insanely cinematic. It's dark, but the exposure looks gorgeous. And on the Sony, it's super bright. So let's go in, let's lower it. And you see, we just have so much information to play with. Lift our shadows up. Let's soften that transition there. Let's lower the exposure to kind of match the Komodo. At -2 stops, we're getting a similar exposure now. We can go in and we can lift these shadows again. Let's go in our darks. We see this equally looks cinematic. Obviously, the texture and everything's a little bit different because we're going from Super 35 to full frame, and the anamorphic adapter I was using, just it's soft and it's out of focus. So I hope you guys can use your imagination. First off, when shooting on the Red Komodo or Red Komodo X, you get one base exposure basically. The middle point of that is around 800 ISO. So if you shift that ISO, you're basically just shifting the way you expose. You're not really changing the exposure actually within cameras. Because when you're shooting a RAW, you go in, you could change it. And so again, 800 is the middle point. The FX3, when you're shooting Cine EI, it's basically the same thing, except when you change the ISO, you're baking that exposure change. You're not actually changing what's happening to the sensor. You're more changing the preview, if that makes sense. And you could bake it in because the Sony doesn't have internal RAW. But the big difference is the Sony FX3 has a second base ISO. So the same way that you treat the Red Komodo, when the 800 is your middle point and anywhere you shift, you're just shifting the preview basically in the way you expose. On the FX3, you go to 12,800 ISO. So you're basically resetting the FX3 sensor to a totally new base. So at 12,800 ISO, you're getting a totally clean signal. So from there, you can either turn the ISO up higher or you can turn it down lower. You're basically just changing the exposure preview in camera. I hope that makes sense. And so the FX3 most likely is gonna do better than the Komodo because of that 12,800 ISO. So I hope this helps some people find out if the Komodo X is gonna do enough low light type stuff for them. The trick is, again, it's just to get somewhat of an exposure on whatever your subject is. If you do that, the sensor's gonna do amazing, but it's not a low light beast like the FX3. So yeah, I think I'm going to buy the Komodo X because I'm starting to shoot more personal work and it's more narrative based. I'll get more usage out of the Komodo, where before when I had the original Komodo, most of my clients, they don't see the difference between that and a mirrorless camera like the FX3, that the dynamic range is insane and it's just a little bit more versatile when you're shooting those run and gun gigs, and most of it's just going straight to social media. Every once in a while it goes to broadcast, but when it does, it's 1080, like it's whatever. But again, for the more narrative stuff, I want the Komodo X just because of the extra color details that you're getting out of this camera. It is wild.